Do you know where your food comes from? Most of us think we know, but we don't actually take the time to really know where it comes from. But we're going to talk about that today. Welcome to another episode of The Good, Bad, and Ugly of Business. I'm your host, Catryn Becker. And in this podcast, we talk to all sorts of different interesting people and successful people because we want to learn what they have learned in their life that has made them so successful. Because while a smart person can learn from their own mistakes, a genius can learn from the mistakes of others. So I know all of you listeners are geniuses and you want to learn how to avoid these mistakes or how to fail through them faster. So my guest today is joining us from the beautiful area of Vancouver Island, Canada, where she is a sustainable aquaculture businesswoman. And we want to learn all about the sustainable aquaculture. What does that mean? What is it? And where exactly does our food come from? So Lourdes Gant, welcome to the show.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure, Catryn. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to learn more about your network. And thanks to Jen Cadet for introducing us, and obviously through JD Fox organization. And I look forward to hear what the show is about. And we will have a really good conversation about something that nourishes us. Pun
That's
intended.
right. That's right. That's right. And nourishment is such a great topic because, I had a client just the other day, yesterday, in fact, and I was asking her, like, when do you feel nourished? Where do you feel nourished? Because there's so many more layers to nourishment than just the food that we ingest.
Absolutely. And at this day and age where there's a lot of talk about mental health, obviously, how stress is a killer, nourishment is a word that I feel appropriate, not just for physical food, but obviously, as you know, um, from both the emotional and intellectual aspects of what makes us feel nourished. So this would be
Mhm.
a really good conversation. I look forward to it.
And thank you for mentioning how we met as the connections, because I think that's something that you're really good at is creating networks and support systems and how we can all connect and benefit from one another. And so I don't always support that enough when I start the introductions of how I know the people that I know, because sometimes I don't know them and they're brand new connections, but you and I have been in the same circle for a little while now. So it's great to have you on as a guest to cover these kind of topics. So let's get into a little bit. Like, so many people, the average person does not think about where their food comes from. Like, I saw this TikTok from a woman the other day who was saying that she was in a restaurant and her friend ordered a steak and the waitress said, "How would you like your cow cooked?" And then the woman who was doing the TikTok said, she was like, "Well, that was a weird way to say it." And she was like, "Well, I don't want steak, so I'm going to get a hamburger." So then the lady goes, "Well, how do you want your cow cooked?" And the woman truly thought that hamburgers came from pig, and that's why it was called ham burger, and that everyone knows that ham comes from pigs. And there was waiters and servers and people in the restaurant industry commenting on this because everyone was saying this has to be a joke. She cannot be serious. And all of these people in the service industry were chiming in saying, no, this is accurate. She might not actually think this, but there are people out there that truly do not know where their food comes from. So tell us a little bit more about what it is that you do in the sustainable aquaculture and where that part of our food comes from.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. It's fascinating because sometimes it can get complicated. I came from the Philippines, a third world country where my family is poverty stricken, and my experience in terms of food is very different, I guess, from people who lives in North America. So just a little bit of a story around that. So I mentioned my family. My mom was a teacher, and my dad was a security guard, which is a blue collar job in terms of being, I guess, in a way better than the normal farmer in the Philippines. So, make the long story short, there were days when I was growing up that we didn't have food because we didn't have
Mm.
enough money actually to buy food. And one of the things that my dad did was actually plant 100 banana trees. And
Mm.
so I associated bananas when we didn't have food. We will have banana for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We will cook it different ways, but it's always a banana if we don't have food to buy in the market. And in a way, I guess from a different perspective, that can be actually probably healthy. It's organic.
Right.
It's organic. It came from our land. We know the land and the soil is healthy, but it's a very different story combined to, okay, was I getting enough nutrients from when I was growing up, just because I was only having very little introduction to different kinds of, I guess, vitamins. Let's just put it that way. So I say that in the premise and the intention of, first, I'm not an expert in this. Obviously, I was a leading learner because I got married into a family firm where my husband is actually a commercial fisherman who has 10,000 hours under the water and was
Wow.
seeing the devastating impact that the fishermen were doing to the ocean's ecology. So he decided to actually farm the species, which is called the geoduck. It's a king clam that he was harvesting from the wild. So I kind of went the roundabout way to your question. But to make the long story short, with all that background and experience I'm sharing, I think it's important to be what I call now myself a leading learner with information at our fingertips. Find out more about, sometimes you think that maybe this vegetable is actually healthy, but now I'm finding, I just came back from the Philippines last month, that our rice and our vegetables may be healthier from that part of the world because the soil is not as contaminated yet compared to the North American soil. So it may be the same vegetable, it may be the same grain, but because of where the soil comes from, in my case, where the ocean, the water comes from, it's a
Yeah.
very different story. Our seaweed from Indonesia may be very different compared to the seaweed here in North America. So find out what's the composition, I guess, of where the food comes from is right now a lot more easier because we have information handy. So that's kind of what I would say would be a good tip.
Well, and it's such a good point because, we're only taught of like, eat a tomato. A tomato is good for you, or, have fish in your diet once a week, limit these things and add more of these things. But it's never talking about the source of where it comes from. I know for us, we live on land and we have a little hobby farm and we do some of our own farming. We have chickens, we have our fresh eggs. I have a vegetable garden. And I know without a doubt, the food that I get from that garden and those eggs that I collect and eat taste so much better than anything I can buy in a market. Who knows when the tomatoes were picked, right? And they've been sitting in a box in a warehouse in climate controlled with forced air, not seeing the sunshine and not having that natural processes that make it ripen to what it's meant to be with its full value. So I know from that sense that it's making a difference for myself and for my family of what we put in. So it's interesting to me of thinking of sustainable farming and just even knowing the word sustainable and kind of what that means for you. So can you please kind of break that down into what sustainable means for you and for your company and your husband's company, Manatee Holdings?
Thank you for sharing that. I love that your family started planting slash growing your food, because I think at the end of the day, you will have no doubt that it's healthy because you grew it from scratch. But on a labeling of sustainable or sustainability for that matter, it's interesting because we've used this branding in the last, I don't know, more than 2 decades, even before it became a word. And now there's a lot of people using it for greenwashing, which is
Mm.
a sad thing. But at the same time, we actually almost wanted to rebrand because now everybody is using the word sustainability. But for me, the word sustainability is lasting. So in the context of our business, the three pillars that compose what sustainability means is leadership, partnership, and stewardship. And when
Mm.
I talk to people about these pillars, I talked about, a leader, I think from the context of my training would be is someone who's just not leading somebody. To me, my definition of leadership is do the right thing even though no one's watching. And so
Mm.
from the context of sustainability, you don't have to have the label, the certification, if you know you're doing the right thing, even though no one's checking, no one's is auditing what you're doing. It's integrity in terms of what you give to people. And then partnership. I love from the Philippines what I learned called in Filipino language bayanihan, which is picture or visualize a home that's being carried by different people, by your
Mm.
neighbors, because you want to transfer it, for example, from one location to another. So in the context of the North American way, I had this hashtag before from Simon Sinek. I think he had this book, and the hashtag was "Together is Better." So
Mm.
for those of you who read I read all his books, and I just love the concept in terms of he has also this book talking about the story of how the book started. Was there was a war between Americans and Vietnamese, and they were fighting, and from the context of lasting, the game is about not just this war. What if we think about a battle in terms of this is a continuing generation? How do we deal with it without thinking that we wanted to win this game, right?
Yeah.
Like the game is ongoing all the time, and it's fascinating because I think Japan has 300-year plans. So if we have like a 300-year plan for our life, even maybe 500-year plan, this is not just about the planet. We're talking about sustainability, the planet now, how we can do things for its betterment. How do we do things to better our lives 300 years from now, so that what we transfer to the next generation, which leads to the next pillar, which is stewardship, of how are we able to carry on that legacy going to the, let's just say, the fourth century of our next generation of grandkids, great grandkids. So I kind of ramble on there, but I think
No, it's
adding
it,
what you're saying, what I'm saying.
yeah, well, and just to even think of terms of 300 years as us personally, because if any of us get 100 years, we would be blessed. So to think in terms of 3 times our life expectancy, the average person can't even hold on to something for 300 days. Like we all set New Year's resolutions on, 1st of January, but in 300 days, are those still something that are happening? Sometimes people can't even hold it for 300 hours. So it does take a lot of strength of character in order to maintain those pillars, as you mentioned, of the leadership, partnership, and stewardship, and being able to take all of those, doing the right thing for the right reasons, and then continuing to do it to set it up. So I find that really fascinating. The other question that comes to mind as we talk about this is, you mentioned you were married into this life. What was that like, marrying into it, when you and your husband were first meeting and you're learning about this? And I love the phrase you used of the lead learner. So can you walk us through kind of that process and that path? And do you think you would have come to this eventually without your husband? Or, is it something that was just already in you and it provided a great opportunity for it to come out?
That's a great question. So I believe that everything that happens to us is divinely orchestrated, if I can say
Mhm.
that. And I don't know if I would have come into this industry if I didn't meet my husband. I had no idea what aquaculture was. I had no idea what this king clam is. It was totally alien to me. My background, for the sake of the audience, is I'm actually a certified public accountant, but I was really big into professional and personal development. So leading learner for me is one of my number one value, right? So I love learning. I just love learning. Put me into a planet where learning is everything that we do every day. That would be me.
Wouldn't that be great?
And because I didn't know anything about in this industry when I joined in 17, maybe 18 years ago now, I thought that what a great, I guess, value to have, because I came from a point of view of, okay, I don't know anything about it, but I think it's the willingness to learn. So when I first started into this, I had no idea of really what this industry was about. And in fact, interestingly, until now, I still have no idea. And I'm saying that in the context of pure humility, that this industry is just so diverse and dynamic that it changes a lot every day. I think if there's one thing that's it's a double-edged sword, both an opportunity and a challenge, is because of that. It's
Mm.
changing so quickly. And even though aquaculture, interestingly, we're talking about 300-year plants, aquaculture is actually a very old industry, but it's just not known It was probably from our ancestors who's been finding ways how to make food out of nowhere just
Yeah.
by mere experience on how they can support their family or their tribe for that matter. But it's only in the last 10 years that it has been like a lot of investors has been putting their money, because as people know, our population is going to reach 9 billion on or before 2050, so we have to find ways how to make food. And so in the context of marrying into the family firm, I've been learning a lot in almost 2 decades now of how this industry is going to support that vision of feeding the planet
Mm.
by 2050. And so that is interesting to me, given the background of where I came from. I'm like, I wanted to be able to not, and I'm not saying bananas are bad. Even I remember, I just don't want to eat bananas every day. And I remember growing up too that banana and sardines were the two food that we have if we don't have enough money to buy food. And so my, I wouldn't even call it a trauma, but my association with banana and sardines were bad to begin with, just
Yeah.
because I associated it when I was growing up. Oh, bananas plus sardines equals no money, you know.
Mm.
And so it's interesting because I gone keto diet beginning of April when I did a no sugar challenge, and sardines was one of the food that I actually really like now.
Oh, good.
And so again, going back to your question of how that's like being married into the family firm, I love it. I think
Mm.
it's fascinating because my husband and I really work together well because we have two different skill set. I'm in the, you talked about the word genius at the beginning of the show, and I believe that we have different geniuses. You know, in the school system, it's kind of challenging because some fishes are asked to us to climb a tree. Obviously,
Right.
they're going to fail. And so each kid, each human being has their own genius, and you just have to, we're talking about, I guess, self-awareness now in the context of self-mastery and self-expression. If you know how to navigate yourself, then it'd be easier to find what your genius is. So for me, my genius is I'm a mechanic, in the context of the Genius U Wealth Dynamics profile, where give me anything that's existing and I'm going to study it of what worked in the past, and then I'm going to make that better. And then
Yeah.
there's also the genius of you're a creator. My son is a creator, meaning they have all these wonderful ideas all the time. So obviously each genius also has a kind of a challenge. So my challenge with making things better would be I may not be open sometimes or not flexible enough for a new idea because it hasn't been tried. For my son, because
Mm.
his ideas are always floating around her head, it can be just he's just always head on the clouds, and that's not good either. And so the main ideal scenario would be have all these geniuses in your team, and so that your support is like a table with four legs. It's hard to stand up, and I guess in the context of sustainability we were talking about, this is where the partnership comes from.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a perfect analogy of partnership. And when we can all be in our genius and supporting one another through that way. So in terms, and I'm a little bit, just a little bit understanding agriculture, farming on the land. I have even less knowledge of aquaculture, farming in the water. But I can only imagine from what I do know of agriculture, it's a very male field. The farmer and the farmer's wife, right? It's never that the farmer is a woman. So from your perspective, and what have you kind of seen in those last 2 decades of being a woman in aquaculture?
Wow, it's been such a both a challenge and an opportunity. Right now, there's a lot of talk of women being in the realm of all of these male dominated industries. 17 years ago, even up to now, I would probably be the only woman sitting on the table every time we have an annual general meeting for shareholders or in an industry specific association. And it's gotten better, but it's still not as many. And I can understand though where that's coming from, meaning, you've been an engineer, and so you know what it's like to be just
Yeah.
the only one sitting on the table. and it's gotten better, but it's still not, I guess, the awareness that even just women in science, women in agriculture, we're still the minority in this industry. And fascinatingly enough, with the advent of DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and acceptance, it's been a world of, you have to really find a balance of, we're talking of not just stereotyping in terms of gender, and especially now that we have more than two genders, and I wanted to be mindful of this, but I'm talking really around the word of the A, which is acceptance. I think that that's the main gist of all of this talk about diversity. Is like, my husband and I just had this conversation today, actually, this morning at breakfast table. We were talking about, it's not even about the gender or whatever you believe in. We're all in this as a human being. And I think if we get that, if we accept that every person in the planet, in the context of sustainability, our planet is just a living, breathing being as well. So, and if we respect each other, respect what the planet has given us, and acknowledge that there's this symbiotic relationship that we all need to have, including living beings, living things. And there's this story just came to me now. He told me this when we first met. Like, just because it's a carrot doesn't mean it doesn't have a feeling. Because if you're, again, and I'm going to go verge into a really controversial, if you're vegetarian, you're vegan, and you don't eat food, this is a whole gamut of conversation around food. Okay, what the spinach tells you, I'm yelling, why are you eating me? The carrot will say, don't bite me. And so there's this whole controversy around it as well, right? But again, on the context of where I came from, honoring the Filipino community in terms of, and even the indigenous community, which is again another conversation, right? If, for example, there's you probably know the story of the pig and the chicken. The chicken hatched some eggs, and in the context of talking about commitment, and just, the pig gave his life, but what if that's his purpose in life, is actually to feed the human, and by the time that he's dead, he's fulfilled his mission, then that would probably be a sacred death. And so in the context of, let's pray that that pig actually got his mission in life. So if the chicken hatched some eggs, he's still walking around, and she's still like giving the golden eggs to the people. That's another mission. And so again, in the context of sustainability, what is each other's mission, so that we can support each other in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. My mission is no poverty, because I came from a country where I was raised in poverty. And so for anybody who can be in my industry, the whole UN SDG is number 14, life below water. And for someone, it can be sustainable cities, or it can be quality education for some of us in the mentoring / coaching capacity. And so what is that? And I kind of went around again with your question, but I think our audience gets this.
Yes, they do. They do. And that's what I love about this podcast is, as the host, I can set it up however I want. And so I love it when it's just conversation and just questioning and thinking and being curious and inquisitive. So yeah, that's way more interesting to me than just straight answering a question, because that doesn't necessarily lead to new thoughts. And growth comes from new thoughts. So yes, it's fascinating to think of that. And I love that you brought up the pig and chicken story, because my husband and I use that analogy a lot of, like, are we the pig or the chicken in this situation? Are we committed? Because the pig, to make bacon, he's very committed. Or are we just interested? The chicken's involved, they're interested in the issue, but they're not committed. So when you started saying that, it made me laugh, because I was like, yes, we use that all the time. So as we're kind of coming to a close, I really loved all of the different topics that we've been able to cover in such a short amount of time. But I think the last thing that I really want to cover is just more about the geoduck, more about the king clam. And, I had never heard about the geoduck until I was watching a cooking program. I used to watch a lot of cooking programs in my 20s and early 30s because I didn't know how to cook. So my solve for that is I just married a man who knew how to cook, and then I stopped watching cooking shows.
Lucky.
But that was my first introduction to the gooey duck, which is quite a delicacy, but it's not something that, especially I think in the majority of North America, have ever even heard of before. So you and your husband, Manatee Holdings, have a company doing sustainable aquaculture, which most people don't know about that anyway. And then you're doing it with a species that most people have never heard about. So I'm curious just a little bit more about the gooey duck and then a little bit more about kind of the branding and marketing that you do for something that's not as common as, say, tuna.
Sounds good. So, Guwidak is from a First Nations word, Gohedak, which means dig deep. And my husband found this when he was a commercial fisherman, as I mentioned, and it actually lives up to 150 years old. We were talking about
Wow.
300-year plan, but this specific animal, king clam, is actually can live up to that longer than our human life. And so they bury themselves under the sand. And so the way that they are bivalve mollusk, and so the way that I don't know if you can Google it of how it looks like or chat GPT it, you will see it has a very long neck and it has a shell. So my husband has been harvesting this from the wild and was comparing having his business head that if you grow a scallop, an oyster, a manila clams, even a sea urchins and a sea cucumber, all these delicacies under the water, the gooey duck has the highest profit margin. The kicker is that it takes 10 years to grow to market size. The
Mm.
market likes 1.8 pounds to be specific. And so that's kind of why he decided I wanted to grow this species because business wise, it's going to be like a legacy plan. To begin with, it needs 10 years, right? He's
Yeah.
such a long-term visionary. And so he's like, I wanted to be able to make sure that when the wild fisheries is collapsing, I wanted to be able to fill in the vacuum into the market by aquaculturing or ranching this specific species. And so that's how it came about. And interestingly enough, Japan, we also talked about Japan a while ago, is the first country who actually originally wanted this. And in fact, this specific species, guidak, is actually in the Japanese emperor's list of gourmet foods.
No way.
Yes. And so, but then market trend shifted, and now all of the products are actually exported to China. So what is fascinating to me as I learned into this industry was there will be different there are different markets who support this industry, but it can be either from another side of Mexico. There are two species. The specific species that we produce is Latin name Panapea generosa, but in different countries there will be another kind with a different Latin name. But
Mm.
when it goes to the market, to China specifically in this example, some people will label their product as Canadian brand, even though it's not, just because the Canadian
Oh.
brand is better. The animals, when it reaches the market, is measured in terms of size and the quality. The neck is a long neck, and you can use it for sushi, sashimi, congee if you're Asian foodie.
Yeah.
And the wider the neck, the higher the price and the better the quality. So it's categorized as quality A, B, and C. So quality A meaning wider neck, crunchier, sweeter in taste if you're eating sashimi. And so most of the people who supply this into the marketplace wanted to associate their product as a Canadian product because of the pristine waters here in Canada. So we get a premium pricing compared to if you've seen this product coming from Korea, for example, or Russia or
Mm.
Mexico. So that's kind of the competitive advantage we have here, the product coming from Canada. On the other side of the pond, which is just south of the border, the United States, where you are, there's actually a big company who we call our worthy competitor, Taylor Shellfish, who actually farm this specific species as well. They're bigger than us, sixth generation of ocean farmers.
Wow.
And the way that they, even just Canadian and US way of producing this product is different. In the States, they produce it intertidally, meaning part of the beach that they own, and they also use divers. But in Canada, there's not much intertidal geoduck farmers who has done this intertidally. Our farm is actually 30 feet, 60 feet under the water. And so
Mm.
subtidal aquaculture, we call it. So there's a gamut of, I guess, terms, terminologies, and technical, I guess, wordings that I can use. But in the simplicity, for simplicity's sake, it's just really we're farming food from the ocean versus from land. If you want a simple wording for what we actually do, and it's very niche, but at the same time, it's like it's still food at the end of the day. It's
Yeah.
still it's a clam. It's something that you can make a stir fry with, as I mentioned, sashimi sushi or in congee soup. And so if you chat GPT or Google recipes for geoduck, you'll find a lot of things. And it's gotten famous because I think it's in a TV show before, Dirty Jobs. And it's very hard. It's very hard labor, intensive labor. In fact, in our income statement, if you're an accountant like me, the profit and loss, the highest expense that we have is labor, because we use divers who have boats, and we pay $2,000 to have them harvest these products.
Wow. This is fascinating. I wish I would have started off with these questions because I have like so many more now. I just, the amount of things in the world that people spend their time on to do, it's incredible. And we get so much in our own bubble and only being concerned about with, you know, our own universe of what we're working on. But when we can like stop and learn about someone else, it just, I love it. I love it so much. I find so much inspiration from this.
Thank you. And pun intended, the world is our oyster in terms of learning. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we should end here because we can't get better than that. The world is our oyster.
Thank you.
So Lourdes, thank you so much for being on here. I truly appreciate it. If someone wants to learn more about you and what you do in Manatee Holdings, how is the best way for them to get a hold of you?
I'm very active on social media. The best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. You can find me there, or I have a podcast as well, sustainableaquaculture.ca/podcast, which you can also find on your favorite channels, iTunes, Spotify, Buzzsprout, or your favorite channel. Thank you so much for having me, Catryn. I really appreciate you.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. And to the listeners, thank you guys so much for being here. We couldn't do it without you. I hope you found so much value in this conversation as I did. Go look up what a geoduck looks like if you haven't already, so you can see what it is that we're talking about. And until next time, take care, everyone.